I think there's no point in my going over issues better covered already by people who have specialized in those areas. So we discussed it earlier, and I thought I'll focus on freedom of speech and expression and what is happening to it. Trying, of course, to link it with other rights that are being assailed or suppressed. There was a time when I believed and proclaimed in various fora that when it came to freedom, independence, and the general state of the Indian press, or our press, we were in an enviable position, certainly in relation to every other developing country. That was, Professor Romela Thapar took us back to the freedom struggle. I can't claim to have any direct experience of that, but certainly 40 years ago, when the news media environment seemed more open, more capacious, more welcoming than it has been at any time anyone could recall in post-independent India, I think we did believe that. And let me remind you, that was a period after the suppression of the press during the authoritarian emergency of 75-77, and the press and a large number of journalists freed from the enslavement and inglorious role they played during the emergency. By and large, they seemed eager and energized to take full advantage of the new opportunities that had opened up. And these were, of course, opportunities for accelerated and expansive growth, relatively unfettered functioning, and unaccustomed commercial success. A phenomenon described by the political scientist Robert Jeffrey as India's newspaper revolution. But even more important than that growth, there were significant sections of the press. They had opportunities for playing a more meaningful, energetic, and effective role in the striving for a democratic, secular, progressive, and just society. That is the important point. And that's what connects that period with the present. There are people who say that, compare what's happening today to what we went through to the emergency. I don't think that would be accurate. It would be what philosophers call a category error. We haven't reached that stage. And as Prashant pointed out, there is still scope for optimism. This meeting itself, the petition filed by 5 distinguished scholars and others who stand for these values, I think speaks to a much more positive situation than what we faced during the emergency. But nevertheless, I think that comparison is relevant. What made us think that we were once upon a time in an enviable state? Not the system of law protecting freedom of speech and expression guaranteed to all citizens by Part 3 of the Constitution, and the truth that is now being increasingly recognized by legal scholars and, of course, practitioners of the law, is that the protection offered by 19.1a to the fundamental right to freedom of speech and expression, and by extension through judicial interpretation to freedom of the press, is intrinsically and systematically flawed. There's been fairly interesting literature on this subject. I refer to Gautam Bhatia's very useful and insightful book called Offend, Shock, or Disturb, and also Abhinav Chandrachud's book, more recently published book, which argues that the present state of our laws and the jurisprudence is more status quoist than really radical or transformative. I think I don't have to go into the details. I'm not a lawyer, but we all face this all the time. I also share Prashant's view that the Supreme Court and the higher judiciary has by and large let us down. The Gautam Bhatia speaks about two tensions, two streams of judgments in the courts, the Supreme Court in particular, one that is by and large supportive of free speech and the other going for restrictions. And sometimes in the same judgment, you find both. There's a tension between these two streams. That point has been well made in the conclusion to this book by Gautam Bhatia. And we face it all the time. The law of criminal defamation, the law of sedition. And I don't think even the lawyers here would be very familiar with Section 124 of the Indian Penal Code, which was recently invoked in Tamil Nadu against the editor of a publication called Nakiran Gopal. Not only him, but almost all the employees there. Even Prashant may have not had the opportunity to appear for anyone against whom Section 124 has been used. Now, what is this section? Just to give you an example, I'd never heard of it till I went to the magistrate's court. It says, assaulting president, governor, etc., with intent to compel or restrain the exercise of any lawful power, whoever with the intention of inducing or compelling the president or governor of any state to exercise or refrain from exercising in any manner any of the lawful powers, blocking the exercise of lawful powers, not unlawful powers. And how do you do it? Assaults or wrongfully restrains or attempts wrongfully to restrain or overawes by means of criminal force or the show of criminal force or attempts to overawe, etc., shall be punished with imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend to 7 years and shall also be liable to fine. And believe it or not, this section was, the police filed a criminal case against Gopal and several others working in this organization called Nakiran for a series of investigative reports on the governor and the Raj Bhavan. He made allegations, but it was investigative journalism. It was quite strong stuff. But to invoke this section against a series of investigative articles, I think defied any common sense. And in this case, I was able to go to the courtroom, and I'm happy to say the magistrate rejected remand, the prosecution's demand for this. And now they filed an appeal before the High Court, where one of the main grounds is that I was allowed to speak, somebody who had absolutely no connection with this case. I said I was not a lawyer. The magistrate saw me and said, what is your view? I expressed it. In the initial order, the magistrate said he was unhappy with this part, as though this had swung the case. It had nothing. The lawyers argued the case. I made the point that it's extremely dangerous to allow this because it will be picked up everywhere. It's very rare. I'd never heard of this being used against free speech or freedom of the press and so on. The matter is listed before the High Court, and on Tuesday they'll hear it. This is the extent to which the executive powers, of course they do it, the Hindu right does it all the time, and they have infiltrated many institutions. But there are also authoritarian forces at the state level which use it, learning from each other. They're pushing the limits of the law, and hats off to the magistrate who rejected remand of Nakiran Gopal in this case. But in most cases, as is well known, magistrates do not apply their mind. And when it goes to the High Court, it's a lottery. People see which judge is there and so on, and they go. But as often as not, it is you don't get the relief. And in this particular case, where Professor Romila Thapa heads the list of petitioners, I think the judiciary has not done well by freedom of speech and expression. No question about it. It's still a matter in progress in the lower courts and so on. But we see what we are up against. One of the points that Gautam Bhatia makes is, and many others make also, is what the courts say about free speech has very little connection with what actually happens on the ground when people exercise this. And I think it's time for us to focus on what needs to be done. And in that connection, I think first we have to be clear, why free speech? Why do you? Because you don't take for granted that everyone is for it. Why, you have to argue intellectually and even theoretically where it's relevant, why free speech? And there are many arguments for free speech, going back to the assertion that that's a way of reaching the truth, goes back to Milton, John Stuart Mill and all that. I don't know, there's no time to go into all that. But we must be very clear why we advocate or champion freedom of speech and expression. From what standpoint or what theoretical framework or ideological position do we advocate free speech? It's not just the liberal claim, I think. Political liberalism often proves to be very weak when it defends this against authoritarian forces, against majoritarianism in India. I think you need a much more radical approach to the defense of freedom of speech and expression, linking it with the fight for justice, linking it with with support for the struggles of the marginalized, the non-privileged, the working people, the working poor, the people who are oppressed, for Dalits and other sections of the oppressed in India. I think we have to link this and bring it to, and I'm very interested to see how the right to Article 14 of the Constitution, equality before the law, is there. I think it's a very good point that you have this discrimination. These goons go and attack. You see it in Kerala, in Sabrimalai, in the whole case, under the guise of devotees. They attack women journalists. They threaten. They openly defy the Supreme Court's order. Nothing, of course, the police there have behaved well. I think they've been even-handed, but in most places, there is clear discrimination. They attack free speech, they attack other constitutional values, and openly defy it. Nothing happens to them. But when somebody resists it, I don't like the word activist. That's a label used by the press as though there's something slightly suspicious about it. You're not a serious academic, you're an activist, as though it detracts from your scholarship or your expertise in these areas. Prashant Bhushan is an activist lawyer. He's a very good lawyer, but he's often called activist in these circles. We should reject such labels and judge issues on merits. People who uphold these values are what we are talking about. And it's inspiring to see somebody of the intellectual and academic stature of Romila Thapa, Prabhat Patnaik and others, and very fine lawyers coming forward to this. But what is to be done? I have the following, which was some of it covered. We need to have an educational campaign on why the right to dissent, which is organically connected to the right of freedom of speech and expression, the right to organize, the right to protest peacefully, is important. Why that is important in our democracy. Link it. Draw the connections rigorously. Make the connections rigorously. Particularly go to schools and colleges to carry on this campaign. We don't know how students and young people think about it, but we can't take it for granted that they all want freedom of speech and expression. We've got to work hard on it and carry out an educational campaign. Secondly, the importance of pursuing the right legal strategies, providing dissenters access to public-spirited and quality legal services on a free or inexpensive basis, raise legal funds to meet court expenses and so on, even when lawyers of the stature of Prashant or Brinda Grover appear pro bono, but still it costs. We have to take it as our cause and raise legal funds to support it. Whether it's a journalist somewhere being attacked or sued, or so-called activists, pro-people, campaigners, fighters for the people's rights being targeted. We've got to take it up as the cause. It also applies to the Me Too movement. When MJ Akbar sues I was very heartened to see lawyers come forward, available, but we need to get it organized. There must be a cell nationally and in different states where a pool of lawyers who are willing to appear, and I'm very pleased to see that some of that is happening. Enlisting support from the media, that's a big, tall order, because at the moment, most of my colleagues, most of the sections of the media, I'm afraid, I have to acknowledge this, are behaving as though there is no independence. The myth of independence in the media. There are a few famous lines about a British journalist, which I think applies perfectly to the Indian situation. And it runs something like this, by Humpert Wolff. You can't hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist, but considering what the man will do unasked, there's no occasion to. And this self-censorship, doing what you don't have to do, I think has to be, we have to take it into account and address the issue patiently, not insulting them, but seeing what really happens on the ground. And this has to be carried on in professional organizations as well as through media criticism. And I think studies that to be done on it. I see some signs of change, because when elections come, maybe you see which way the wind is blowing, at least in certain parts of the country. I also hope what Prashant predicted comes true, but we still wait and watch. But I think this is important to get in, and articles have to be got into the press. Reporting has to be more objective, more factual, more detailed, more on the front pages as well. So I think all these things are to be done, and there's more to do. But I thought some of these suggestions are what occurred to me. Thank you, Professor Thapar, Professor Patnaik, and others for what you've been doing, and we are with you. I'm certainly with you.